Hello and welcome to Nudge, the Consumer Psychology Podcast. I'm your host, Phil Agnew, and today we'll be discussing branding. Branding is one of those subjects that is endlessly debated by the marketing community. And yet, as a young marketer studying and learning my trade, I struggled to understand what the real purpose of a brand was. I heard my peers in similar roles talking about staying on brand, about using the right brand tone of voice. I'd seen ideas of mine discredited because they weren't in line with our branding. It's easy to nod in agreement with these types of comments, but I wanted to find out why branding was so important and what it was really for. Now, at a basic level, branding is a mechanism to sell more goods and services, but brands have become much more than that. They are a seminal part of our society and our culture. A study by Nickelodeon suggested that children, by their 10th birthday, can recall over 400 different brands. But why do marketers spend so much money building their brands? What happens in a consumer's mind when they see a brand? And why is branding such an important part of marketing? To answer these questions, I'm joined by Dr. Matt Johnson, a neuroscientist who is focused on bridging the gap between science and business. His book Blindsight is co-authored by Prince Ghuman, a former CMO with decades of marketing experience at high-growth companies. Both Matt and Prince now lecture at the Holt International School of Business in San Francisco, and they run the Neuromarketing Bootcamp, which helps marketers better understand their work through the lens of neuroscience. Now let's start with Matt and Prince explaining why they became so interested in consumer psychology, starting with Matt talking through his career to date.
Myself, I come from the world of neuroscience. So I did a PhD in cognitive neuroscience. My entirety of my 20s was effectively in labs and libraries, just diving really, really deep into very, very specialized topics within the field of neuroscience. I'm completely driven by curiosity, really what sort of makes us do the things we do. Why do we do the things we do? And I come to the question of consumer behavior sort of as my general orientation. And so I come from it purely from sort of a science curiosity standpoint, which is sort of a contrast from the practitioner-based approach that Prince comes in with.
Yeah, and sort of in contrast to that, we've my background has been also driven by curiosity, but I would say primarily driven by application. So I was fortunate enough to work at startups early on in my career. And what that means is you're able to test a lot of things early on. So I was on the other side of Matt's world, where I would read as many of his abstracts as I could without my head exploding, because the vocabulary for abstracts is a whole different thing, and try to test some of those things that I'm reading in abstracts and pop psych books and pop neuroscience books. So I did that for almost 15 years before Matt and I converged upon teaching at the university at Holt Business School. And really at that point, in the process of teaching a class on neuromarketing, one of the things that we learned was there's sort of this divide between marketers and consumers, and it shouldn't be. Consumers want amazing products and brands and experiences, and marketers such as yourself and I, Phil, want to create that. And yet somehow there's this weird divide, almost a mistrust there. So, I see neuromarketing as a way to bridge that divide, and that's where Matt and I come together.
Matt and Prince's book is called Blindsight. The story behind that name is really interesting. In the book, both Matt and Prince explain how a blind person can navigate a cluttered room without stepping on any objects. Somehow, blind people can subconsciously perceive additional information, like the sound of their foot hitting the floor and the pressure of the floorboards, allowing them to walk through the room without tripping up. Our mind is often doing a lot of additional work behind the scenes that we're not aware of. The book Blindsight aims to give us marketers and consumers an understanding of that process. I asked Matt and Prince about the behind-the-scenes ways brands affect our decision-making. Here's Matt explaining the neuroscience behind branding.
Yeah. So I think it's branding is fascinating from the standpoint of neuroscience. And so I think for me, the question isn't so much what a brand is, but it's really where a brand is. And so a brand really from the standpoint of neuroscience is totality of the semantic and emotional associations that you have with it. So it exists nowhere else but in the brains of consumers. So it's a lot of talk of brand constitutions and what's in the brand charter and what's in the brand message and all of this constructed behind closed doors. But if these associations aren't ingrained into the brains of consumers, then they, in effect, don't exist.
Yeah, well put, Matt. I think as a marketer, we get caught up in brand voice docs and brand guidelines and all these things and being on brand versus off brand and all that stuff. But ultimately what we forget, I think, is worth highlighting here is brands are the space between subjectivity and objectivity, right? That's where a brand sits. You can get a cotton t-shirt for $2. You can get 2 cotton t-shirts for $2, or you can pay, $150 for a Yeezy brand cotton t-shirt, probably made in the same factory, and yet 2 completely different experiences. And that's the power of a brand.
Prince says brands sit in the space between objectivity and subjectivity. A great brand can elevate something which is objectively normal into something which is subjectively great. A classic example of this is Pepsi versus Cola. There's a famous study that reveals that many Coca-Cola fans who have purchased the soda for years actually prefer Pepsi when tasting the drinks blind. The researchers concluded that these loyal fans got most of their enjoyment not from the taste of Coca-Cola, but instead from the brand. Here's Matt talking through that example and explaining the science behind it.
Most listeners will probably be familiar with the famous Pepsi challenge, right? So if you believe that you're drinking Coca-Cola and it's only Pepsi, you'll actually taste the liquid better. It'll actually be perceived better to you. And that's really the power of the brand. So when you don't put the brand here, people actually slightly prefer Pepsi, even though they're diehard Coke fans. So that's the sort of classic example of placebo effects when it comes to functional brand value. But then there's this extends into wine. So wine is a huge area where these brand effects make a massive, massive difference. So the same exact wine hitting your tongue will actually be perceived to taste better if you believe it's from a high-class winery, if it has more syllables in the wine bottle's name, if it's served in a crystal glass as opposed to a styrofoam cup. There's all of these effects which have nothing to do fundamentally with the sensation at the level of the tongue, but have everything to do with this gap that Prince mentioned, which is between subjectivity and objectivity. And that's really the marketer's playground. That's really the role of the brand to create these amazing experiences for us as consumers. So we do talk about the specific ways in which certain brands can come across in a bit of an unethical way. But I think we owe a massive debt to brands in just the amazingness of the experiences they can create for us. In many ways, they sculpt our very experience of reality.
I mean, that's one of those things. Is it truly trickery if at the level of the brain, you are tasting a specific flavor that just hits differently? Is it really trickery if me wearing my Jordans, I jump an inch or two higher in my vertical leap? Right. And that's the Nike golf example is perfect for this, and I'll summarize it quickly, but I think it's fascinating. It isn't just tricking your taste buds, right? It's you give professional golfers sets of golf clubs to go hit the fairways, right? So you've got the unnamed, and then you have starter brand, which is a budget brand, and you have Nike brand, and see who hits furthest. And of course, Nike brand golf club goes the furthest, drives the furthest. And then you find out ultimately that it was exactly the same golf club, just with a different brand on top. And that sort of stuff really gives you a moment to sit back and truly underline the point that when done ethically, this stuff is charming. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Man, if I'm a professional golfer, I do want to hit the ball further. Why wouldn't I, right? If I'm a professional basketball player, I do want to dunk on everyone. I want whatever advantage there is. And I think when it comes to brand, perception really is reality. I think we have to do it ethically, but Matt put it best. Between subjectivity and objectivity is the marketer's playground, is the branding team's playground. And I think doing it ethically, we find a really good balance between marketer and consumer.
Brands can make wine taste better. Brands can help you hit further on the golf course. And brands can also change how you're perceived by others. An incredible study by Dutch researchers showed that people wearing clothes with a visible brand, a premium brand like the Tommy Hilfiger logo or the Lacoste logo, were viewed more positively and actually treated differently than those without brands. In the experiment, subjects evaluated photos of people wearing branded clothing. Some subjects saw photos with the logos digitally removed, but with identical models and styles. The people with the visible branding on their clothes were judged to be of a higher status and wealthier than those without the logos. Another experiment showed participants a video of a job interview. The male interviewee was either seen with or without a visible brand on their clothing. Not only was the candidate with branded clothing judged to be more suitable for the job, but his recommended salary was also 9% higher. The most surprising experiment in the series took place in a real-world setting, in a shopping mall. In this study, the researcher approached shoppers and asked them to participate in a short survey. While only 13% of those approached cooperated when the researcher wore an unbranded sweater, a huge 52% agreed to join in with the study when she wore the identical sweater but with a designer logo on top. That difference, more than a 4-fold increase, is really incredible. This all explains why branding is so important. It helps explain why Coca-Cola spend $4 billion a year marketing their brand. But what about recall? What makes some brands stick in our minds? What makes some products more memorable than others?
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic question. So the way that we like to think about it is brands are like characters in a movie. And you can think of any given movie as being that industry. And so sometimes there's going to be the leading characters within that movie that are obviously going to stand out in your head. So if you're talking about the movie of athletics, this is going to be Nike and Adidas. You're always going to remember those. But that doesn't mean that you're only going to remember those two characters in the movie that play a leading role and that have all the exposure. You're also going to remember the characters that really, really stand out. So if everybody in the movie is very, very, very sullen and very sort of down, and one person in the movie is all ippity and has a really bright personality that stands out relative to everybody else, then chances are after you leave the movie theater, you're going to remember that specific character. And so I think it's important to keep in mind from the standpoint of brands that absolutely exposure is massive. The exposure effect is very real, and this has a huge role in nailing down these associations within our semantic network. But there's a huge role for differentiation as well, and the consideration that really everything that we process is relative to something else.
Yeah, and to add on to that, we live in a world where everyone knows Coca-Cola. So why is still Coca-Cola spending billions of dollars a year, right? And I think it's one of those totally, what Matt said earlier is like marketers have instinctually converged upon certain scientific findings because they're out here just testing stuff. But you go back to the 30s and 40s where the rule of 7 first came out, or the law of 7. It's really funny when we're writing the book, Matt's like, what's this law of 7 that marketers like? I was like, first of all, it's BS. It's not real. But it was just a funny thing that even, pop marketing in Matt's world is like, oh, this rule of 7 must be a thing. But when you think about the rule of 7, which is if your consumer hears a message 7 times, they're more likely to buy, right? The number 7 doesn't matter, right? The number itself is inscientific, but the concept underneath it, the mere exposure effect, absolutely applies. Absolutely. And the other thing that helps with memory is positioning, right? The brain is a pattern learning machine. So it is constantly picking up on patterns. And so much of that is done without your conscious knowledge. And yet when something breaks through that pattern, marketers, we call it differentiation or positioning, right? Neuroscientists might call that attention. And then, part of the memory package is grabbing attention as well, right? So you can't be an extra on this stage that Matt said. He said it perfectly. Characters in a movie, there's supporting cast members and there's extras, right? The more you differentiate, the closer you work towards being the lead. As opposed to the worse you are differentiating as a brand, you are going to be a supporting cast member at best or an extra in the back at worst.
The movie example is great because we've all got examples we can reference. For me, I think of Star Wars. Luke Skywalker is pretty much Coca-Cola in the movie. We remember him because of the mere exposure effect. He is in the majority of the scenes and he gets the most airtime on screen. And yet most viewers also remember Jabba the Hutt. Jabba has far less screen time, barely any lines, and yet he is also remembered pretty significantly. Why? Because he is distinct in the movie. His low voice, his grotesque, scaly skin, and slug-like appearance really stands out. While Luke is Coca-Cola, Jabba is, I guess, Monster energy drink. Monster's unique brand, advertising, and packaging stands out compared to the normal soft drink advertising. Now, most marketers think achieving mere exposure with potential consumers is very costly. It costs a lot of money to get somebody to see your brand several times. But Matt and Prince cite companies who have found smart ways to achieve this without spending billions on advertising. Joe and the Juice, a coffee house and smoothie shop, achieves the mere exposure effect by initially only creating stores in 4 locations: London, Sydney, San Fran, and Amsterdam. That's in addition to their original stores in Scandinavia. Now, by focusing their expansion in those specific areas rather than spreading their stores across multiple cities, they increased their exposure and ultimately their likability in the places they actually were based. It helped the company compete with the likes of Starbucks without having to build a coffee shop in every city across the globe. But awareness and memory are different things. It's one thing to be aware of a coffee shop brand, and it's another, though, to remember their ads. I asked Matt and Prince to talk about memory, specifically to debunk some misconceptions that many marketers have. Here's Matt explaining that most of us are pretty bad at remembering brands.
Memory is one of those things where it's very, very counterintuitive. So we walk around the world with the idea that we just have the record button on. And that later, if we're trying to conjure up a memory, we can just press the rewind button and we can just replay the experience. But it turns out that neither of those things are true. So looking first at this process of recording, which in neuroscience terms we call encoding. So you're encoding an experience. And it turns out that not all aspects of the experience are equally weighted in memory, and that your state of mind during the creation of the memory, during the encoding process, is very, very important. So the study that you cited that we talked about in the book is by Diana Tamir and colleagues, which found that if you're at a concert and you pull your phone out and you're trying to record it on your phone, chances are you're actually not going to actually remember the experience as much. And that's because you are exporting your encoding responsibilities to your phone. You're actually not focusing that much on the actual experience. You're not straining your attention to take in that experience. You think you're going to watch it later, you're going to throw the content up on Instagram, whatever the case may be, but your actually memory for it is impoverished as a result. So the mind state which is present during the encoding process is very, very important in the types of memories and the quality of memories and the degree to which you can remember certain things after the fact.
It is naive to think that customers will remember your brand after seeing your ad, or even that customers will remember your brand after they've purchased your product. Prince goes on to talk about how different types of advertisements affect memory. While a billboard is unlikely to be encoded in the long-term memory of your consumers, other advertising mediums are far more memorable. Specifically, video game advertising appears to really help with memory encoding. Here's Prince explaining why.
What's beautiful about that is, in some ways, in the world of video gaming, as an advertising measure, it's slightly underutilized, but it takes more effort, right? So just like recording on the camera, you're going to pay less net attention to what is happening because you're also focusing on the camera and the images and the right exposure and all that stuff. Think about what's happening with video games. You are actively engaging. Your brain is fully sucked into a video game. So a really easy example is creating cute little stairs that as soon as you step on them, they play music. And if you happen to be a musical company, Spotify, a musical instrument company, a Yamaha, immediately that's an application that will encode Yamaha deeper into your brain if you've got a Yamaha sponsored set of stairs at a subway and people are just walking around going, oh, Yamaha, bing, 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 right? But in video games, it's taken to the next level. In video games, if you can create a branded experience that is within the context of a character, a racing game, whatever that may be, that is a much deeper encoding of memory.
So far, we've learned that brands can change our perception of a product or service. We have heard how they can increase the amount we pay for a brand and even our enjoyment of the product. We've dug deep into why some brands are far more memorable and even looked at tactics to help increase recall. But before ending the discussion, I wanted to know, are Matt and Prince still affected by branding? Do they still fall for the same tricks as the rest of us? Or does their knowledge of how our brains work make them immune?
No, absolutely. Like, as much as we have studied this and as much as we know the depths and the intricacies and the potency of placebo effects and functional brand value, it doesn't make me like brands any less. And it doesn't make me any less prone to these sorts of effects. I'm not immune just because I know about it. And I think that's a wonderful thing. I think my experience as a consumer would be degraded if I was somehow immune to these placebo effects. So for me, that brand is Nike. I've always liked Nike, and I have a long-term collaboration with Nike, and I've worked up with Nike. And for me, Nike shoes are just a step above the rest. And when I wear Nikes, when I have some basketball shoes on or whatever else, it makes me feel differently than if I'm wearing a generic brand, if I'm wearing a different brand. And that is owed basically to nowhere else but the associations I have with it. It's owed to the brand. So yeah, for me personally, it doesn't make me any more immune to these brand effects.
Yeah, I mean, it also does not make me immune. If anything, it makes me appreciate a bit more. For me, I also picked a pair of shoes, but for me, it's a pair of Red Wing shoes, boots. I don't know what it is about them. There's plenty of amazing shoemakers all over the world, especially in UK. I don't know what it is about those pair of shoes, but I get it. They sell very much an Americana image. They have a brand perception that I sort of internalize when I put them on. So it's not going to help me jump high or anything, but maybe it gives me, I don't even know how to measure it, that little 10% boost in confidence if I'm speaking in front of a few thousand people, whatever that may be. So yeah, I'm going to stand by Red Wing, but specifically the little boots that make me feel a bit more ready to perform. I'm wearing them right now, funnily enough, not in front of an audience.
Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today, but don't worry, Matt and Prince will be back in 2 weeks' time with another episode on Nudge, where we'll discuss the power of storytelling in marketing. To make sure you don't miss that episode, please sign up to the Nudge mailing list, the link to which is in the show notes. Sign up to that and I'll send you an email every time a new show goes live. And if you've enjoyed today's show, I'd highly recommend picking up a copy of Matt and Prince's book, Blindsight. It is one of the most up-to-date books on how consumer psychology and marketing interact, and it's jam-packed with great examples of how brands influence us with their marketing. Matt and Prince also run a neuromarketing bootcamp, which can help you and your teams level up your understanding and help you start to apply some of the principles we've talked about today to your work. Both the link to the book and the boot camps are in the show notes, so go down there and click those if you want to find out more. Anyway, that is all for today. Thank you again for listening to this episode of Nudge.